Global Pavilion, realizing just transitions. Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP30 in Billy.
Good morning. Welcome to the press briefing by the German delegation with the State Secretary Jochen Flasbarth and Professor Catherine D. Wolfram of the MIT Institute in Boston. We will talk about current developments in emissions trading on an EU level, a national level, and above all, an international level. That is the topic of our press briefing, which is available in German and English language. And I will just hand over the floor to Jochen Flasbarth.
Good morning, everybody. This time we do it bilingual. Welcome, Catherine. Good to have you here. Ich switche jetzt auf Deutsch. Warum ist der Emissionshandel vor 20 Jahren in Europa eingeführt?
20 years ago. Well, at the time we had ambitious climate targets, not as ambitious as today, but it was clear that this would be one of the most fundamental transformations of the European economy. And the introduction of the emissions trading scheme was a profound change in our approach to environment policy. Until then, there were regulatory provisions and possibly also some funding schemes as an alternative. With regulatory provisions, the far-reaching decarbonization of industry and energy sectors could not be achieved because on the one hand, we would have had to have micromanagement right down into industrial processes, or we would have had reduction targets, clear reduction targets, without a trading system. And for all companies and all businesses, that would have meant the same obligation, the same targets. The emissions trading scheme sets targets, sets limits through a trading scheme which controls emissions reduction in a way that makes sense economically and that tackles the place where it can be realized in a most cost-effective way. And that was the core of our efforts, and it also meant a transition away from the environment policy that we had up to then in Germany and Europe. The emissions trading scheme proved to be incredibly effective. The reduction targets that we had in the EU for industry and energy sectors were completely organized in this trading scheme, covered by this trading scheme. That's not surprising because via the emissions cap, the ETS makes sure that reduction targets are complied with, and the trading scheme means that economic costs are offset and are balanced. We now have 38 emissions trading schemes worldwide at different levels of development, and 20 more schemes are currently in the process of being developed. And perhaps by way of an anecdote, you might allow me to add that the good and friendly relationship with the chief negotiator of China goes back to our first meeting when we discussed emissions trading. I was the president of the German Environment Agency And he came to visit us in 2010, wanted to know about emissions trading, and he wanted to learn how we did it. And I thought it would be a half-an-hour meeting, but he spent hours and hours, and we couldn't get enough experts to come and talk to him and to answer all his questions. And to this day, he still tells me that the start of the Chinese emissions trading scheme had its roots in Berlin when he came to visit the Federal Environment Agency. So that's just an anecdote that I always remember when I talk about emissions trading. Apart from the control function, the emissions trading scheme also has a revenue side. Perhaps it's not a matter of course. And at the beginning, especially in the energy sector, we had 100% free allocations. We changed that over time because it became then necessary for energy providers to buy allowances to create revenue for the EU member states, 50 billion euros in revenue for EU countries at this point. And this revenue is used to fund in transformation projects in the states that use this emission trading scheme. I would now like to talk about the CBAM as well. For a long time in Europe, and the emissions trading scheme didn't really work very well. We had very low carbon levies, below 3 euros. And even as a non-economic expert, we can see that this is not very effective when it comes to controlling emissions. The trading scheme was such a new scheme, and it had so many exceptions in terms of regulations. And that basically shows you who the lobbyists were and which lobbyists stayed in the room longest when the ETS was set up. So we reformed the emissions trading scheme, and this reform made it clear that the levy would go up to 100 euros. And that was the point at which we had to think about protective mechanisms for industry. A cost block of 70, 80, or even 100 euros for industrial businesses that compete internationally, such as the steel industry, for example, and imposing the same levy on those industries all over the world, or rather industries that have similar prices in all markets across the world. And if you impose these high levies on these industries, it'll be their demise. And if you don't want that, you have two options. You can allocate allowances for free, as we used to do it and as we're still doing it. But as we reduce the overall emissions cap, this mechanism is reaching its capacity because there are not enough allowances anymore to allocate them for free. And that is why we came up with CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which tackles key industries that rely on a level playing field on the global market and allows them to offset their CO2 levies for imports. At that time, I attended the meeting of the Environment Council in Brussels, and I know that at the time I said, there's no alternative. We have to have a CBAM. We have to have a border mechanism, but people won't like it. And that's actually how it turned out to be. We had an intense discussion here at the COP. Unilateral measures is a term that was often mentioned. And of course, the outrage is understandable, but sometimes unilateral measures is also used as a buzzword now. And we have to make sure that we keep this discussion on a reasonable path. All the states that have a relevant CO2 price, a relevant carbon levy for their industries, will see soon that without protective mechanisms, they won't be able to manage. This afternoon, we've been invited by Brazil to talk about a coalition of countries that want to introduce compliance carbon mechanisms and to discuss how they can protect their industries also on an international level. This will be a whole side event, and we announced that Germany would be happy to take part in such an open coalition. because we need a reasonable, structured dialogue about this. Because I already said countries that use carbon pricing mechanisms have to make sure that they don't ruin their industries by doing that. Because if that happens, we would also lose the support of our society. And by that remark, I would like to finish.
Guten Tag. I know that my last name is German, but I don't speak German, so I'm going to speak in English. I'm a professor at MIT, and I study climate and energy economics, and I've been studying the CBAM for several years. And I have come to really love the CBAM. And I know that that puts me in a minority, but let me explain what it is about the CBAM that I think is so transformative. And I really think that 10 years from now, we may look back and see the CBAM as a turning point in the way that the globe has addressed climate change. So as the State Secretary said, there are now a number of countries that are imposing ETSs. And I have some academic work that's documented the increase in discussions about carbon pricing, about decarbonization, about ETS in countries other than the countries in the EU since the EU started talking about the CBAM. So in my mind, Turkey is a perfect example of this. Turkey exports a lot of its manufacturing to the European Union. Turkey faces this decision: do we have our companies write checks and send them to Brussels, or do we put on our own carbon price and keep the money domestically? And I think that type of logic has really led to this virtuous circle where more and more countries are thinking about carbon pricing. Turkey is just one example, but the examples of China, Brazil, India, very large emitters around the world are starting to do this. And in my estimation, the revenues from CBAM that the EU loses are trivial relative to the revenues that the EU will gain as it gets rid of the free allowances. So the domestic revenues from carbon pricing are really substantial. And so I've been part of an international working group that has been working with Brazil, helping to think about what a coalition might look like. A coalition of countries that are interested in carbon pricing. And I think there are two facts that come out of that work that I'd like to highlight. One is, if you look at the CBAM sectors, the sectors first covered by the CBAM, the steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizer, globally, over 80% of the emissions in those sectors are already covered by carbon prices. And so I think that there is already evidence that CBAM is having this kind of proliferation effect and encouraging other countries to think about carbon pricing. Another fact that we highlight is it kind of made sense for the EU to focus on these sectors at the outset because they're heavily traded. Something like 40% of the aluminum that's produced is consumed in a country other than where it was produced. And so now that we have these carbon pricing schemes proliferating amongst these heavily traded goods, we think it's important for countries to get together, and instead of having a proliferation of CBAMs with different reporting requirements, potentially countries can talk together about how to have some, if not fully multilateral, plurilateral understanding of how we trade goods that are regulated by carbon pricing. But as I say, let me just return to the point, I give huge credit to the European Union for pursuing this ambitious policy, and I think it's really encouraging other countries to go down the decarbonization pathway in a way that no other policy globally has done in the past.
Much, Mrs. Wolfram. We come now to your questions. Wir kommen jetzt zu Ihren Fragen. Ich will noch mal kurz hinweisen auf
I would
das
like to point to
Side-Event,
the
was
side event once again that has just been mentioned, the kick-off meeting of this Open Carbon Pricing Coalition at 2:30 in the São Paulo room. Now, your questions.
unilateral trade measures that Flasbarth mentioned. Don't you think it would have been better to use them to decarbonize the industries in the global south, so they can actually, which would be good for trade relations, which would be good for decarbonization, and which would probably be a more efficient use of the funds than putting them into European industry again. And secondly, I was wondering if CBAM is actually, because of the, it's only one direction, so exports from Europe to the rest of the world are still less competitive maybe. Can it actually strengthen internal demand or calls for stronger internal demand if you have to rely more on internal demand from Europe because CBAM makes your industry less competitive on the world market? Thank you.
Sure. So on the first question, in our report, we lay out several options that high-income countries might want to think about as ways to induce low and middle-income countries into the coalition. And one of those is exactly as you say, think about some kind of climate finance that would encourage the low and middle-income country heavy industries to decarbonize. As part of our working group, we've had a number of conversations with policymakers in countries like Indonesia and Mozambique, and that's attractive to them. And again, I think it has this kind of self-reinforcing virtuous cycle that if the low and middle-income country heavy industries see that they will be supported along their decarbonization pathway, they are more accepting of ambitious climate goals. That said, revenue is revenue. I don't think it has to be the CBAM revenue that finances that climate finance. It's, you know, whatever pot of money it comes from, it doesn't matter, but I do think that that's something that the heavy industry should think about. On your second question, like, first of all, at a high level, the ideal CBAM is a CBAM that you never have to enforce because it encourages other countries to adopt carbon pricing. And then you don't need to worry about exports because, like, globally, most of the demand is already facing goods that are covered by carbon prices.
May I just, one thought from my side. As Catherine said, I mean, there is an obligation under the Paris Agreement and the further decisions throughout the COPs for developed countries taking the lead in financing the transformation in the developing world. And just looking at one of our key partners and competitors industry-wise, let's take India. Germany, now I'm talking in my former capacity at the Ministry for Development, the biggest portfolio we have in the world is with India. It counts to around 1 billion euros annually, just from Germany. And basically, I would say 90% out of this 1 billion is covering the energy transformation. And then we are doing something also with our International Climate Initiative from this ministry. So same with South Africa, Brazil. So the big emerging economies we are addressing with our support, not necessarily linked to the CBAM revenues, as Catherine said.
Good morning, Professor Wolfram. I'm a journalist from India, and India is in the process of getting its carbon markets. My question regarding the CBAM is as follows, that even if, of course it takes time for the carbon market to pick up, but let's presume by some miracle it picks up overnight, and the market discovered price for carbon in a developing country, a lower middle income developing country, is never going to be the same as the price in the EU, or at least not in the foreseeable future. So this is not an administered price. One of the questions that emerges on the CBAM is this: how do you address the difference? Because if ultimately exports from developing countries have to come to the European border and pay for the difference in the European carbon price and whatever carbon price is levied at home, let's presume that, I'm making yet another assumption that the carbon intensity of the product is the same, then it kind of raises the cost, the price of the imports. Now that fulfills the protection part of the problem. I'm wondering, how do you address that? Is that possible to address that?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. So the international working group that we put together released a report in September that outlined several scenarios that a potential coalition like the Open Coalition could pursue. And one of the scenarios that we outlined, and I'll just emphasize this is an academic exercise, it's for the policymakers and the politicians to negotiate, but one of the scenarios that we outlined would have membership in the coalition at different levels of carbon pricing for different levels of income, so that low and low middle income countries could join the coalition maybe at 1/3 the carbon price that the high income countries would need to achieve. So I think it's necessary to reflect fairness. One of the ways to reflect fairness is through climate finance. Another, potentially complementary way to reflect fairness is by having this graduated pricing scheme. So I think there's some technical details like that could be worked out in a way that help recognize the fairness principles. I think there are even more technical details where you could imagine that India is allowed into the coalition if the domestic carbon price is 1/3, but exports to the EU, those specific exports would have to pay the difference between the India price and the EU price. But I guess let me just say at a high level as well, I think the global south is growing tremendously, right? And so that growth, as well as the kind of natural ability to install solar capacity, insulation levels in the tropics are very high. The global south has the potential to, become kind of a powerhouse of clean energy production. And a world that prices carbon is a world that rewards those resources, right? A world that prices carbon is a world where solar energy is very valuable, and countries that can produce a lot of solar energy become economically very competitive.
Just information now, the State Secretary has to leave now because of his role as facilitator, but Mrs. Wolfram can remain for some minutes for another question. So we continue with, okay. we just go forward. We go forward.
Ms. Wolfram, Lukas Knigge for Table Briefings. So the current debate in Europe is actually to turn back some rules of the ETS. There's a second ETS that is postponed by a year. There's a debate of prolonging the free allowances for the industry and so on and so forth. And Mr. Flasbarth just described how important it is to get rid of the free certificates and replace it by CBAM. Is your assessment as well that it is under attack? And what problems do you see with prolonging those free allowances? Thank you.
I'm not an expert on German or European politics, but yes, I've read that it's under attack. I think we need to do everything we can to defend the CBAM. I think the CBAM is, as I've said, it's this crucial policy. It's really the linchpin that is encouraging other countries to raise their ambition. That said, I think another beautiful part of CBAM is the fact that it ramps up slowly. And so that gives other countries time to develop their carbon pricing systems, for countries to kind of gain trust in one another's carbon pricing systems, for the carbon pricing systems to evolve to look more similar to the ETS. So right now in China, the carbon pricing system, they have something that's kind of like free allowances, but they're phasing those out also. So, you know, the phase out will give us time to align the carbon pricing systems around the world.
Okay, I think we are done with all the questions. Thank you very much for the press briefing of today. And I can just hint on Monday, then the Federal Ministry of Environment, Carsten Schneider, is here for his first press conference Monday morning at 9:30 a.m. Soweit für heute mit dem deutschen Pressebriefing, und die nächste Pressekonferenz dann mit Umweltminister Carsten.
On Monday at 9:30 with the Federal Minister for the Environment. Thank you.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP30 in Billy.